Hi everyone, my name's Leanne and today I'm going to be reviewing all of the books that I read in August. So I mentioned this in my most recent TBR jar, or if you've watched the video, it's more of a TBR sugar bowl video. But I really feel like August just disappeared. Like I managed to read so much in the month and I read a lot of really great stuff, but I feel like the month really just went by in a flash. I read 11 books in August and that has given me quite a lot of momentum going into my reading in September. Already in September, we're about a week in when I'm filming this and I have read so much already. This always tends to happen with me. I will speed up my reading as we come into those autumnal months. I always read more in the second half of the year than I do in the first. Also, I'm really sorry, by the way, if you can hear my washing machine in the back of this. Girls try to multitask. As I said, I have 11 books to talk to you about today. I have 6 books of adult fiction. One of those is a classic. 2 young adult fictions, 1 young adult non-fiction, 2 middle grade, and 1 non-fiction book for adults. And I'm going to start with that one. And that is Chavs by Owen Jones. So one of my reading ambitions for this going into the second half of the year was to ensure that there were no books left on my TBR that I purchased prior to 2020. And this was one of the worst offenders for this on my TBR. I've had this book for a really long time and hadn't picked it up yet. This is a book about working class culture and how the working class have been demonized, specifically in British culture. It looks at how politicians and media have portrayed people from working class communities, from people that have lived in estates, how they have portrayed particular elements of working class culture, like the working class connection with going to football and the idea of football hooligans and the types of kind of music and clothes that working class people have typically grown up with. Essentially, the book is a dissection of the prejudice and ignorance towards working class people in Britain. One of the reasons I'd put off reading this for quite a long time because it was written, I think, like 10 years ago, maybe longer ago than that. And for the past couple of years while it's been sat on my TBR, I have been wondering like, oh, is it slightly out of date? And reading it now in 2024, it really isn't. Like, so much of what Owen Jones is discussing in this book is still super relevant and I think incredibly relevant given the political landscape in Britain in 2024. As someone who is not from Britain but has lived in Britain for 10 years, I find the class system that there is here really interesting because it's so ingrained and cultural and has so much complexity and nuance to it as well. I think there were many elements of the social and political landscape in Britain at the minute that could be described as broken. And I think the class system is one of those. The political and social divides, the prejudice and ignorance that exists within all kinds of people. And I think this book is a really fantastic discussion point in terms of dissecting how that has been puppeteered and orchestrated by those people who seek personal gain from division. I would really recommend reading this one if any of those topics interest you. Now, another book that has been on my TBR for a very long time and I finally got round to reading it is Welcome to Lagos. And this was such a colourful and rich depiction of the city and of Nigeria. The sounds, the smells, the sights, the people is so finely crafted in quite a matter of fact but really immersive sort of way. In many ways it feels like Lagos itself, the city, is a character. In this book, we're following an unlikely mix of characters who come together because they're all making a journey from Bayelsa to Lagos in search for a better life. And they're all leaving for a range of different reasons and they come from a range of different life experiences and they're really unlikely band of characters to come together. There was a lot in here about the social and political landscape and complications that there are in Nigeria. The book had really short chapters, which I really enjoyed, but we are moving between a lot of different characters' perspectives, so I would recommend picking this one up if you have quite a long time to delve into the novel. I think if you were picking this up in bits and pieces, it might be quite difficult to kind of remember where you are and who you're with. It's quite a winding and an unexpected plot in many ways. Many of the places that we ended up in the novel, I had no idea we were in for that sort of ride when I picked up the book. And I was really impressed by how the author managed to balance really quite serious and important topics with a story that's really entertaining and also funny. So another really great read in August. I have a couple of romance books next, so let's go with those. I read The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood. I feel like I am the last romance fan to have finally picked this one up, but I had such a great time with this. So this is about a third-year PhD candidate called Olive, who's trying to convince one of her best friends that she is dating someone, but this is a lie, this isn't true, and in a slight moment of madness, she kisses this random guy to try and show to her friend that she is dating someone. But then she realizes the person that she has smooched is Adam Carlson, who is a professor with a very bad reputation for being a bit of an arse. He has this reputation for being really frosty, really harsh on his students, but slightly bafflingly, he agrees to fake date Olive. And fake dating is one of my favorite tropes. I will never grow tired of seeing how people perform romance. And obviously with these fake dating situations, you know, the same thing always happens. They are spending time together, they are performing romance, and through that they realize that they actually do really like each other, and neither party wants to admit that they are getting feelings for the other person because they're not supposed to be. The sexual tension between these two characters was absolutely spot on. I think it was really well paced in terms of the build up of that sexual tension and then the payoff of when you actually get to those intimate scenes. It felt like that tension had really, really ramped up. One of my other favorite tropes is Grumpy Sunshine, and this is definitely Grumpy Sunshine, like to the point where it is slightly ridiculous, but you kind of just lean into it. So the romance plot I thought was absolutely fantastic, but I also really enjoyed seeing the depiction of the STEM elements of this book. So what it is like to have that kind of intense scientist background, and particularly what it is like to be a woman in that field. There was actually way more discussion of that than I was expecting, and I think that's a really good thing. It's not something I have any real kind of awareness of. I don't come from any kind of STEM background, so I don't know what that lifestyle is like, particularly at that very kind of high academic level. So I really appreciated learning a bit more about what that was like from a female perspective. So overall, would really recommend this one. In many ways, there are times where it is quite silly, but I enjoy that. The other romance book I read was Love Her or Lose Her by Tessa Bailey. So this is the second book in the Hot and Hammered series, and I was really excited to read this because I loved the first book, Fix Her Up. And this is set in the same community, the same family, but we're following different characters. I do really love in that setup of romance books where you're following people who are kind of related in some way, whether that's, you know, through siblings or friendships, and you see the characters from like the first book pop up and you get a little bit of seeing how their story unfolded whilst mainly following another couple. I really enjoy that. Love Her or Lose Her was not for me in the same way that I think Fix Her Up was. I didn't enjoy this one as much, and that's not a reflection of its quality. I think it's just the situation and the characters were not something that I connected to in the same way or found as entertaining or sexy. What I did really love about this book is that we are following a married couple. So a couple that got married when they were quite young. I think they're now about 27, 28, and they are having really big substantial problems in their marriage that they need to deal with. They are really on the edge of separation and end up going to couples counselling in order to try and save the marriage. And I really appreciated that because we read so many romance books that are about the beginning of the relationship, but of course the relationship doesn't end with constant happiness. You know, once you get together, there are still hurdles in the road, there are still challenges to overcome. And I did really enjoy having a romance story that was about a later stage of a relationship. I don't think we see that enough. And it's tricky with romance books because so often it comes down to personal preference. But the male lead character in this, Dominic, was just, I didn't like him at all. So he's an ex-soldier. He is very kind of like hyper masculine, domineering. Like, hyper masculinity is not something that I really have any attraction to. He's very traditional in wanting to be a protector and a provider for his wife. And I don't think it's in a misogynistic way whatsoever. It's just he's a very, protective person, and he has this idea of how he should support his wife. And over the course of the novel, he learns how his wife actually wants to have that protection and affection expressed to her. And I think that was a really important depiction to see in a relationship, was how you need to understand how the other person wants to receive love. You can't just assume they want it in the same way as you would. So the fact that I didn't enjoy this one enough isn't really a criticism of the novel. It's just that the main male lead, I would not want to spend any amount of time with. So it's really difficult, I think, in a romance book where you're meant to understand someone being really attracted to someone and you just don't. I have a few more Tessa Bailey books on my shelf, and I definitely want to read more of them because I know there will be other lead characters that I connect with a lot more. I also read Last Chance Saloon by Marian Keyes. This was the book I took on holiday. I normally bring like 2 or 3 books on holiday with me, and it's slightly ridiculous even if I'm only going away for a few days. And instead I decided to bring one chunky book. So I've read quite a few Marian Keyes books now. I've spoken about it a lot on the channel, so I won't go on about it too much. This is about 3 friends who have been best friends since they were teenagers, and then they have all moved to London and are trying to kind of muddle their way through London life. They're now in their early 30s. They've been living in London for 10 years. And in various ways, they're all kind of stuck in their circumstances. I really enjoyed how this book showcased the complexities of growing up, and how even into your 30s and beyond, you are still growing up and trying to figure it out. And I think in the first half of this book, I was just having a good time with these characters. I was going along with their journeys, but I didn't feel hugely invested in them. But when we get into the latter half of the book, Marian Keyes begins to tackle some really quite heavy emotional topics. And that's what I love about her books so much, is that she's able to handle really difficult subject matters with a lightness of touch and humour, which really is how people handle them in their own lives, right? So this book has quite a lot to do with what it is like to become seriously ill, and what it is like for your friends and your romantic partner when you become very seriously ill. But it also has a lot to do with really quite extreme misogyny, particularly in the workplace. I do think office culture has moved on quite a lot in the years since this book was written, but I'm sure a level of misogyny still exists. But I found it quite shocking to see how women were treated in office workplaces, and that absolutely gross misogyny that exists. Maybe I'm slightly ignorant of it because I work in a kind of female dominated industry, or at least my office is anyway. But they were both really important emotional topics that I thought were dealt with brilliantly. I think I will always massively recommend every Marian Keyes book that I ever read. Speaking of misogyny, I read How to Kill a Guy in 10 Ways by Eve Kelman. If you liked the film Promising Young Woman, then you will really like this book. So we're following a woman named Millie who sets up this hotline for women to phone if they are on a night out, if they are on a date and they feel in some way unsafe. Millie quickly realizes that so many women are going to use this. She realizes the frequency with which women are made to feel unsafe by men in these types of situations, how often they feel like they need to reach out and ask for help, and how often really violent and dangerous situations are orchestrated by men to prey on vulnerable women. And Millie is motivated to take this intervention even further when her sister is assaulted. And essentially this is a very dark novel about all of the men she murders and her pursuit of finding out who it was that attacked her sister. It's very entertaining to see all of the different ways she comes up with ways to kill these guys. I don't know why I feel the need to be like, obviously we don't endorse murder. I mean, literally the amount of old crime and thrillers that are written by men where women are murdered willy-nilly for the sake of entertainment. I don't really know why I feel the need to give that disclaimer, but I am. It's a really unhinged portrayal of a woman taking revenge into her own hands. So if you really like things like Sweet Pea or the TV show Killing Eve, I would really recommend this one. You do find out who the person who assaulted her sister was, and I'm not sure if it was meant to be a twist, but I think it's really, really obvious who's done it. If you've also read this one, I would love to know if you also found it really obvious, or if it was a surprise for you. This was really entertaining. I liked it a lot. So the classic that I read in August was Silas Marner by George Eliot. So I've had a bit of a mixed experience with George Eliot's books. Middlemarch is one of my favourite classics of all time. I enjoyed The Mill on the Floss a lot. I didn't particularly care for Daniel Deronda. And this was the next book I was reading from George Eliot. And I thought this was fine. We know I do appreciate a short classic, so that was a plus point. So this is about a man called Silas Marner who has lived an incredibly isolated life for about 15 years. He was shunned from the previous place that he lived in, moved to this new English provincial town. And because of how he was shunned by his old community, he has really lost his faith, not only his faith in God and religion, but also his faith in human connection and community. So he spent these 15 years being really isolated, a lot of prejudice and judgment towards him in the community, and he's really lost any understanding of value in life, and the only thing he seems to value is hoarding lots and lots of money. He lives very frugally and is just building up this pot of cash. I don't want to spoil the exact details of the plot, but he ends up adopting a child, a young girl, and he parents her for 16 years. And then her biological father, who has never claimed to be her father, he has never shared the fact that he was her father, he's never shown interest in being her father. When she is 16, he then decides that he would like to bring her back into his family and adopt her. And the daughter is then faced with deciding what she values the most. The 16-year relationship that she has had with Silas, where he has been her father, or the opportunity of a more comfortable life with her biological father. And really this book is about Silas finding his sense of purpose and community again after spending so much time in isolation and shutting himself off from the world. I just have no particularly strong feelings about this book. I'm glad I read it because I do eventually, lifetime goal, not only read all of my Penguin English Library books, but I would like to read everything that George Eliot has written eventually. But this is just not a new favourite classic for me. Okay, so now onto the books for younger readers. I have 3 books that I read for work, so I'm going to leave those to the end. Of the 2 that I read that weren't for work, the first of those is Like a Curse by Elle McNichol. So this is the follow-up to Like a Charm. Elle McNichol is one of my favourite middle grade writers, and I'm really excited for her first young adult novel that's coming out, I think very soon, like in the next few weeks. As I said, this is the second book in this Scottish set witchy middle grade. We are following our main character Ramya, who is meant to be spending her time learning more about her witchy powers from her aunt Opal. But this isn't really going to plan, and she ends up taking a lot of her education into her own hands in ways that are exactly safe. I really love the Scottish setting of this book. I love it being in Edinburgh and Loch Ness. I love how kind of Scottish folklore is used, and the kind of myths and legends that are brought into this series are ones that we don't always see in fiction. I also think it's brilliant that Elle McNichol always has neurodivergent protagonists. I think it's really important inclusion to have those in middle grade books. Now, typically with magical middle grades, I tend to always enjoy the first book more than the sequels because I love going on that initial journey with the protagonist where they are welcomed into something new and you are learning about it alongside them. And the second book tends to be a bit more action-packed, and I don't love kind of action scenes as much. So I definitely felt that way about this book. But nonetheless, I had a really great time. I love how the protagonist deviates from what we might traditionally expect to be the hero of the story, and it shows strength and intelligence in power and in different ways. Elle McNichol is another writer who eventually I want to have read everything that she has written. So another one that I really enjoyed. A young adult book I read in August was The Million Pieces of Nina Gill by Emma Smith Barton. Now I'm going to be honest, I read this so quickly and so compulsively that it hasn't fully stayed with me. I feel like I just devoured it so quickly that it didn't fully embed in my brain. Does anyone else find that? I had an incredible time reading it. Like, I definitely remember the reason I read it so compulsively and so quickly was because I couldn't put it down. I was finding it so compulsively readable. It's a novel about growing up and adolescence in the face of mental unwellness or mental illness. We're following Nina, who has always been really well behaved, but then her brother, who has had several behavioral issues over the years that have ramped up in recent times. He goes missing and her family becomes really fractured. Her parents become increasingly overprotective of her because they've just had one kid go missing. They've seen one kid's behavior spiral out of control and then go missing. They don't want the same thing to happen again. And I think it's interesting as you read these young adult novels as you get older and you begin to sympathize with the parents way more than you may have done if you'd read it when you were closer to the teenage protagonist's age, because I totally get where the parents are coming from in their overprotectiveness. But that does end up, of course, as it always does, pushing Nina even further away and into an even darker place, and she is really losing her grip of her own sanity and what is real. The novel does get really quite dark in places. Now that I'm talking about it, it's starting to all kind of come back to me. I do remember just kind of finishing the book and feeling quite emotionally spent, because it does deal with really hard-hitting subject matters, but I think that is so important in YA. Okay, now onto the 3 books that I read for work. Let's stick with YA while we're on it. I read The Things We Leave Behind by Claire Furness, and this is a dystopian novel that reimagines the refugee crisis if London was the place that people needed to flee. So it follows a period of civil unrest in London and conflict, and I found it really interesting reading this book at a similar time to reading Chavs, because that civil unrest is at the core of both of those books, even though they are very different books. You know, while Chavs is a non-fiction book about real world events that was written like 10 years ago, and this is a novel written this year. It's a young adult dystopian about a teenager that has grown up in an authoritarian regime. They do both explore that kind of civil unrest and conflict and prejudice that there is in Britain. I think given all of the events that have happened not only this year but specifically in recent months in London and around Britain, this felt so timely and so important, and it felt like it was something that could happen one day. I would really highly recommend this one. It feels so important and relevant, and in many ways is a real kind of warning to what might happen one day if we're not careful. The young adult non-fiction book I read was Welcome to Sex by Dr. Melissa Kahn and Yumi Steins. This is a real kind of no-nonsense guide to, as the cover and the title suggests, sex. So it looks at all things from puberty and menstruation to relationships for sexual experiences, the range of different sexual experiences there are. It looks at sexuality and gender. It's really comprehensive, really thorough. It is illustrated throughout, a lot of which I wouldn't be able to show you on the channel because many of the illustrations are, you know, intimate, and I think that is so important. Like, education is power. It is so important that young people, that teenagers have resources to look to be properly educated around relationships and sex and all of the stuff that goes with it. There are a range of different experiences and different types of people included in the illustrations and in the content. There are many adults out there that I think kind of don't want to accept that education is power, and actually the more you know about sex, the safer you really are. I just think it's so important that people have resources like this, and I thought this is brilliant. And then finally, I have a magical middle grade to talk about. This is Ember Spark and the Thunder of Dragons by Abby Elphinstone. This is the first book in a new magical middle grade series from Abby. We are following Ember Spark, who is a really likable young girl, as she becomes an apprentice vet to Rusty Fizzbang, and all of the characters in this book just have the most incredible names. Ember is the newest recruit to become an apprentice vet, and she is looking at incredible magical creatures. They are so fantastical, they are so beautiful. But while she's trying to learn, there is a villain hot on her tail, and that is Jasper Hornswoggle. It's high action, high stakes, adventurous, but also has this really beautiful message around like protecting animals and caring for animals, but also has a gorgeous depiction of kind of nature and the environment as well. I just love a magical middle grade, so really enjoyed this one and excited to read the second book. So they are all of the books I read in August. Do leave me a comment down below and let me know if you've read any of these, what you thought of them, or let me know what your favorite book that you read in August was. If you want to let me know you're here but you don't have anything in particular to say, leave me some sort of witchy emoji in honor of like a curse. universe. As I said, I am going into an amazing reading month in September. My reading month has got off to such a good start, and I hope I continue that momentum throughout the rest of the month and throughout the final bit of the year. That is it for me today. I hope you're doing well, and I will speak to you in my next video.